The morning I nearly torched my entire diplomatic career over a child who wasn't even human started the same way every morning in Sector 9 started, with a form. Form 7 Delta Provisional specifically. Application for temporary residency reclassification, non-treaty species, dependent category. 3 pages, 6 seals, 2 witness signatures, and a notarization in a script I'd spent 4 months learning to read and still couldn't fully parse. I had it open on my desk at 700 hours when the door to Welfare Station 11 chimed, and I finished filling in the box marked applicant lineage. Attach supplementary documentation if lineage spans more than 3 recognized phyla, before I looked up. I looked up because of the sound. Not a knock, not the chime continuing. A different sound, something between a high-pitched whistle and a dry cough, rhythmic and getting worse. The kind of sound that bypasses rational processing and lands directly in the part of the brain that handles emergencies. I was around my desk before I'd made a conscious decision to move. I opened the door myself. The child was on the floor of the access corridor. Small, maybe the size of a human 6-year-old, though I knew enough about Veth physiology to know that size was a terrible measure of age for their species. Gray-green skin, 4-limbed, with a pair of auxiliary sensory tendrils above the eye ridge that the Veth used to read air pressure and chemical gradients. Both tendrils were lying flat against the floor and trembling. The eyes, large, amber, pupilless, were open but unfocused. The sound I'd heard was breathing, labored breathing, the kind that told me the chest cavity wasn't doing what it was supposed to do. I dropped to one knee. "Hey," I said. It was a stupid thing to say. The child almost certainly didn't speak standard. I said it anyway. "Hey, I'm here, I've got you." The corridor of Welfare Station 11 in the 9th Administrative Sector of the Interstellar Compact's governance hub was not a place where things like this were supposed to happen. It was a place for paperwork, for the application of procedural frameworks to the untidy problem of displaced species, orphan dependents, treaty-adjacent life forms who needed the compact to fill a box for them. I was the man who filled boxes. I had been filling boxes for 7 years, first as a junior attaché in the Earth Diplomatic Corps, then as a seconded human representative to the Compact's Bureau of Species Welfare. I was good at my job precisely because I did not deviate from procedure. I followed the forms. I observed the protocols. I filed in triplicate when triplicate was required, and in duplicate when triplicate was excessive, and I had never once, in 7 years, filed something that didn't have a form to go with it. I picked the child up. I did not call for assistance first. I did not verify species classification, which was technically required before physical contact with an unregistered non-treaty organism. I did not complete an incident report, file a contact notification, or consult the interspecies physical interaction guidelines that lived in a binder on the 3rd shelf of my cabinet, right between the Emergency Protocols Manual and the updated Compact Medical Reference, Non-Signatory Species, Volume III, Edition 6. I did not do any of those things. I picked up a shaking, whistling, frightened alien child and carried it into my office and set it down on my desk where the light was better. Her eyes tracked to my face. That was the first coherent thing they did, focused, found me held. "I've got you," I said again, still stupid, still the only thing I had. Her name, I learned later, was Seal. She was, by Veth reckoning, approximately 3 years old, which in human developmental terms mapped roughly to 7 or 8. She had been left in the corridor sometime before 6:30 hours by a Veth adult whose identity remained unknown. The adult had simply walked away. In Veth culture, abandonment of a dependent was not illegal. The Veth had no law against it, because in their social structure it had historically never happened. Dependents were communal responsibility. There was no cultural framework for the act of leaving one behind, no word for it in any Veth dialect I could access. The same way there's no word in most human languages for the color that lives between blue and green on a spectrum we can't see. When something has never happened, you don't build language for it. The Compact's welfare framework, written primarily by species that reproduce differently, had no clear provision for it either. Seal existed, legally speaking, in a gap. I found all of this out over the next 3 hours while I sat next to my desk and monitored her breathing and worked through every directory in my system looking for a VETH community liaison, a species welfare officer with VETH clearance, a medical protocol for VETH respiratory distress, anything. The VETH had no permanent representation in the Compact. They were a Category 3 species, pre-accession, observed status, which meant they had observers in gallery seats during council sessions and no legal standing whatsoever. Their collective biological and social data was filed under pending assessment in a database that hadn't been updated in 11 years because no one had been assigned to update it. There were 3 VETH known to reside in the governance hub sector. One had died 8 months ago. One had left for VETH home space on a transport that hadn't returned. The third was listed simply as present, location unverified, a placeholder notation that I suspected no one had reviewed in years because no one had had reason to. Seal was, as far as the Compact's administrative systems were concerned, a paperwork problem with no applicable form. I pulled up the Compact medical directory and searched for anything with VETH in the index. 12 results came back. 10 were biological survey summaries from first contact missions, heavy on morphology, light on anything useful. There were detailed pages on the VETH skeletal structure, the secondary cartilage joints that allowed that range of limb movement, and 3 pages on the tendrils' electromagnetic sensitivity, and a note that the VETH metabolized most standard Compact nutritional supplements poorly and would require species-specific formulation. None of it told me what to do with a child in respiratory distress. One result was a nutritional study I couldn't immediately see the relevance of, filed by a xenobiologist who had apparently spent 2 years on a VETH colony and come back with 11 published papers, and the specific exhausted look of someone who had been a long way from home for a long time. The last result was a single-page emergency triage addendum filed by a Compact medical officer named Dr. Vahani R.S., who had treated a VETH adult for blunt trauma 7 years ago. At the bottom of the page in the notes field, in the cramped type of someone filling in optional documentation out of conscientiousness rather than requirement, Dr. R.S. had written, VETH respiratory distress secondary to emotional dysregulation responds to sustained low-frequency acoustic input. Unknown mechanism. Observed not confirmed. Recommend further study. No one had done further study. Sustained low-frequency acoustic input. I pulled my chair up next to the desk. I started talking. Nothing in particular. I described my morning, the form I'd been filling out, the coffee that had gone cold on the corner of my desk because I'd forgotten about it, a blend from the Earth Cultural Exchange program that I'd been buying for 6 years because it was the closest thing available in the sector to the stuff my mother used to make. The view from the window of the station, which looked out onto a maintenance corridor and wasn't much of a view. 3 conduits and a ventilation housing, and a stretch of gray-painted hull. I described all of it in detail, slowly, keeping my register low, the way you talk to someone who can't understand you but needs to hear a voice anyway, not performing calm, actually finding it in the act of describing ordinary things in ordinary tones. My mother used to do it with her plants. She had a particular theory about plants preferring low-frequency sound to high-frequency, and she'd go through her kitchen garden talking about whatever was on her mind while she watered. I had thought it was ridiculous when I was 12. I had been wrong about many things at 12. I thought about that, talking to Seal, and almost laughed and kept my voice level instead. After about 20 minutes, her breathing smoothed out. Not all the way, not to normal. but the labored whistle dropped to something closer to a sustained hiss, which was wrong but manageable, and the trembling in her limbs decreased. Her tendrils came up off the desk surface slowly and moved toward the sound. I kept talking. I filed 7 requests that day. Emergency species welfare assessment denied, no applicable species protocol. The response was automated, generated in the 4 seconds between submission and return. The system had a checkbox for species not found in registry and a corresponding output of request cannot be processed. It was not unkind. It was simply a system that had not been built to handle what I was asking it to handle. Temporary medical hold authorization denied. VETH not classified under medical hold eligibility. A different automated response, this one slightly longer, with a paragraph about the criteria for medical hold eligibility and how to apply for species-specific reclassification. The reclassification process took, according to the paragraph, between 6 and 18 months depending on available data. Contact request to Compact Council Species Registry returned unprocessed, insufficient identifying data. The Species Registry required a minimum of 3 independent verification sources for any new entry. I had 2, Dr. RS's addendum, and the survey summaries from first contact. The third source would need to come from the VETH themselves, which brought me back to the problem of SEAL being the only VETH in my office. Request to open a Category 3 species emergency file denied. Category 3 species were ineligible for emergency file designation without a council vote. A council vote could be initiated by any recognized species representative with full membership status. Humans had full membership status. I could initiate a vote request. The standard processing time for vote request review was 3 to 4 weeks. Cross-Bureau liaison request to the Bureau of Treaty Affairs returned with a note that VETH species did not fall under Treaty Affairs jurisdiction and should be referred to the Bureau of Pre-Accession Monitoring, whose contact information was appended. I contacted the Bureau of Pre-Accession Monitoring. They referred me back to the Bureau of Species Welfare, which was where I'd started. Request for supervisor review granted. My supervisor, Compliance Director Neth Alwyn, was a careful woman who had been with the Bureau for 16 years and believed deeply in the integrity of process, which I respected and mostly agreed with. She reviewed the case in 40 minutes and called me on the internal channel and said, in the measured way she said all difficult things, that the situation was genuinely unfortunate and that she could see I was concerned, and that the appropriate action given the lack of applicable protocol was to log the child's presence as an unclassified biological entity discovered in administrative premises and submit a request for compact security to arrange temporary containment pending species determination. Containment, I said. It's the standard terminology for. I know what it's standard terminology for, I said. Director, she's 3 years old, or the equivalent of 3 years old. She came here frightened and sick and alone, and she's been calming down for the past 2 hours while I've been talking to her. Containment is not what she needs. Neth Alwyn was quiet for a moment. I understand your concern, Representative Calloway. I truly do. But without a welfare protocol applicable to this species, we cannot authorize care placement, medical treatment, or custody arrangements. The correct path forward is. The correct path forward is a wall, I said. Every path is a wall. I've spent 3 hours walking into walls today. She was quiet again. File the request for security containment, Calloway, she said, more gently than the words warranted. It protects you and it protects her. It creates a legal paper trail. Once she's in the system, even as unclassified, I can push for expedited species assessment. How long? I asked. She didn't answer immediately. These things don't move quickly. I looked at Seal. She was watching me with those amber eyes. Her tendrils had gone still while I'd been on the call, the way they went still when something in the acoustic environment changed. "I'll file the 7th request first," I said. The 7th request I sent directly to the office of Council Coordinator Dreenathvas, who was the administrative head of the Compact's 9th sector, and technically my boss's boss's boss. I had never communicated directly with Dreenathvas. I had attended 3 briefings they had led. I had filed 2 reports that reached their office through the standard routing chain. My name was in their system as a seconded representative in the Bureau of Species Welfare. I was not someone whose direct communications they should have had any particular reason to prioritize. The request asked simply for guidance on the appropriate welfare protocol for an unregistered VETH juvenile in acute distress, currently in my care at Welfare Station 11. The response came back in 4 minutes. A form letter informing me that my request had been received and would be processed in accordance with standard response timelines of 10 to 15 working days. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I picked Seal up off my desk, tucked her against my chest, and started walking toward the central hub. I want to be clear about something. I am not a brave person by nature. I am an administrative person by nature. I have a drawer in my apartment that is organized by category, subcategory, and frequency of use. I have 3 different colored pens for different priority notes. I eat lunch at the same time every day, and I keep a physical calendar as a backup for my digital one, because I don't entirely trust systems I can't see. When I was seconded to the Compact, I read the full 600-page procedural handbook before I read anything else, including the emergency contact list, which my supervisor at the time pointed out was maybe not the optimal order. I believe in process. I believe in systems. I believe that the correct application of established procedure is how you get things done without anyone getting hurt. That belief did not prepare me for the moment I walked out of Welfare Station 11, carrying an alien child I had no legal authority over, and started down the main corridor of Sector 9. I bypassed the first security checkpoint by holding up my access badge and not stopping. The checkpoint officer called after me. I kept walking. The badge cleared the reader. The gate registered my clearance level and opened. I heard the officer calling my name behind me, and then the specific sound of someone deciding whether an incident was worth pursuing, and then footsteps not following. I kept walking. The second checkpoint was staffed by 2 officers who stood up when they saw me coming. I held the badge up again, and this time I also said, as I walked through, Bureau of Species Welfare, Emergency Welfare Situation, Filing Compact Medical Annex 7, which was a document I knew existed but whose contents I could not have quoted with any accuracy. One of the officers reached for their communication device. The other looked at Seal, at her specifically, at her size and her stillness and her tendrils resting against my arm, and put their hand on the first officer's sleeve. I don't know what look passed between them. I didn't turn around to see. The third checkpoint was the entry to the central hub itself, the administrative heart of the Compact's governance hub, where the major bureaus and the council chambers were located. I had my badge up before I reached it. The officer at the gate looked at the badge, looked at me, looked at Seal, and looked at me again. Emergency welfare situation, I said again. I need to reach Chamber 7. The officer was Pelari, one of the Compact's founding species, a species that had been managing complicated political situations for 400 years. She looked at me for a moment with the specific expression of someone calculating risk, and then she opened the gate. I walked through. My hands were completely steady. My heart was doing something I was choosing to ignore. That is the thing about humans that I think the Compact's administrative culture had not fully processed. We are not brave in the heroic sense. We are determined in the specific, stubborn, somewhat unreasonable way of an organism that evolved to refuse to let go of things once we decided they mattered. We sat with dying fires in ice ages and refused to let them go out. We crossed oceans on planks of wood because we wanted to know what was on the other side. We hold things. It is our oldest instinct. It is not always rational. It is almost always at least somewhat effective. I held Seal and walked to the central hub, and I talked the whole way. Narrated the route, the same way I'd been narrating all morning. The long corridor with the mosaic panels donated by 11 different species over 400 years of compact history. Each tile a different texture, a different material language, and at the junction where they met you could see how the aesthetics simply didn't resolve, how each species' contribution was entirely coherent within itself, and together they made something chaotic and somehow beautiful anyway. The security arch with the light that turned 3 different colors. The lift between floors with the 3-note tone. I described all of it in the low, steady voice I'd been using all day, and her tendrils read the air, and she stayed calm, and I stayed calm, and we walked into the central hub like we belonged there, which was a form of audacity I had not previously discovered I possessed. The central hub reception area was staffed by a Pelari clerk named Asavi, who had been at that desk for longer than I'd been in the sector, and who had, in my experience, seen everything without appearing to see anything, the specific gift of someone whose job requires them to be the surface of a still pond regardless of what's happening underneath. Asavi looked at me, looked at Seal, and for just a moment something in their expression moved in a way I didn't have vocabulary for. Not surprise. Not disapproval. Something older than either. I need to see whoever is currently on duty in the Council Welfare Observation Chamber, I said. Council Coordinator Dreenathvas has a session in Chamber 7 that begins in 40 minutes, they said. It is a closed session. Species welfare matters, Bureau classification reviews. Perfect, I said. Asavi looked at me for another long moment. I did not say you were invited, Representative Calloway. I know, I said, I'm going anyway. Something very small and very contained happened in Asavi's face. They reached for their terminal. I'll let them know you're coming, they said, and did not specify in what capacity. Chamber 7 was smaller than the Grand Council chambers used for full session votes. It was designed for working sessions, built for efficiency rather than ceremony. Long oval table, functional overhead lighting, acoustic paneling that made the silence between statements feel like an active substance. When I arrived, it held Coordinator Dreenathvas, who was Gethali, a tall, bilaterally symmetric species with deep-set eyes, and the kind of deliberate stillness that I had once mistaken for patience and later understood was something more like contempt made into posture, the evolutionary inheritance of a species whose ancestors had survived by being absolutely motionless in environments where motion meant predation, and 5 other compact officials from as many species. There was also a bureau physician I recognized named Dr. Saylorn, and in the corner, chairs designated for non-participating species observers, 2 Veth. I had not known there were Veth observers present in this session. Their tendrils were flat and still when I came through the door. Dreenathvas looked at Seal. Nobody spoke. I had thought about what I was going to say during the walk over. I had planned something clear and procedural, a presentation of the relevant facts in the order most likely to invoke the applicable welfare statutes and force a response, laid out with the specificity that the Compact's administrative culture rewarded, organized around the demonstrable failure of the standard processing chain and the documented medical urgency that created a reasonable exception argument. I had the structure of it in my head. It was good. It was the kind of argument I'd been trained to make. I looked at the room, at Dreenathvas's careful stillness, at the 5 officials' varying degrees of careful neutrality, the faces I could read and the ones I couldn't, the accumulated weight of species histories and institutional habits and political calculations happening behind eyes I didn't have the full context for. At the 2 Veth observers sitting in their corner with their tendrils flat, watching me with the specific attention of people witnessing something that directly concerned them and had not been offered any voice in its proceeding. I put the speech aside. She was left in the corridor outside my station this morning, I said. She was in respiratory distress. The compact systems have no applicable protocol for her. I've filed 7 requests today and received 0 actionable responses. I'm here because I have run out of other places to go. The silence after that was the densest silence I had been in during 7 years in the compact. Dreenath Vass's gaze moved from Seal to me and stayed there. When they spoke, their voice had the same temperature it always had, neither warm nor cold, the voice of someone who had made a discipline of not letting temperature into their speech. You have entered a closed session without authorization, they said. You are in possession of an unregistered biological entity without documentation of legal custody or care authority. And you have, according to the access log I am looking at right now, bypassed 3 security checkpoints without stopping for compliance verification. Yes, I said. That is a significant number of procedural violations, Representative Calloway. I know. The appropriate course of action, upon finding an unregistered entity in welfare distress, is to file the relevant intake forms and await assessment by the designated species welfare team. There is no designated species welfare team for VETH, I said. There is no applicable intake form. The Bureau of Species Welfare does not have a protocol for Category 3 pre-accession species because the assumption built into the system is that pre-accession species will not have dependents inside compact space who require welfare intervention. That assumption was wrong this morning. She is 3 years old, approximately. She has been in respiratory distress since before 6:30 hours. She has been alone. I have spent 7 hours trying to find a system that could help her and found nothing. I walked here because I could not find any other direction to walk. The silence came back. This time it had a different quality, not the silence of officials calculating a response to an intrusion, but the silence of a room where several people were calculating something more complicated than that. I had been in enough compact sessions to know the difference. It was Dr. Saylorn who broke it. The child requires medical attention, she said. Her voice was professional and clipped in the way of someone who had separated their professional register from their personal one and was using the former to contain the latter. Yes, I said. You should have brought her directly to the medical wing. The medical wing declined to create a case file for her without a species welfare authorization code, which required a Bureau of Species Welfare intake form, which requires species registration, which requires a council registry classification, which requires a vote, which requires a minimum processing time of 3 to 4 weeks. I stopped. I pulled in a breath and made it even. There is a loop in the system. I've been in the loop all day. I walked out of it. Seal made a sound. A small sound, the kind she made when she was uncertain. I'd been cataloging them for hours, the small vocabulary of her distress and ease. I moved my arm slightly, the one she had her tendrils around, a small adjustment, a reminder of presence. She went quiet. Every person in the room was looking at me. Not at her, at me, at the small adjustment I had made and the specific way her tendrils had responded to it, the call and answer of it, the evidence of 7 hours of improvised communication between a species that had evolved to read the electromagnetic signatures of the air and a species that had evolved to hold fires burning against the cold. No one in that room had administrative language for what they were looking at. The compact had formal protocols for hundreds of interspecies interactions, carefully negotiated and documented over 400 years. It did not have a protocol for this. I had been in the compact long enough to know that the silence after that was not nothing. In Gethali culture, silence in a negotiation was an active state, not the absence of speech but a form of it, the equivalent of a held breath that meant the other party was running calculations they didn't want to show. Dreenath Vass had gone very still in the specific Gethali way, which was like watching a mountain decide to be a mountain. In Pelari culture, the same silence meant someone was deciding whether to be helpful or whether being helpful was too expensive. Dr. Saylorn was doing something precise with her expression that told me she had already made her decision and was waiting for the room to catch up to her. In Duvari culture, silence meant one or more of their minds. They operated on a partial distributed cognitive model, 2 or 3 semi-autonomous cognitive centers that negotiated consensus, had just changed positions on something and the rest were catching up. The Duvari delegate was entirely still. The 2 Veth observers in the corner had not moved throughout any of this. Their tendrils were flat and slow and continuous in their readings of the air. I was aware of them the way you're aware of something important happening at the edge of your peripheral vision. I didn't break the silence. I had learned, slowly and at some cost over 7 years, that the worst thing you could do in a room full of people making up their minds was to fill the silence with more of your own voice. The argument was made. Adding to it would only give them something to argue against. I stood there with Seal and waited. She was calm. She had gone still the way she went still when the acoustic environment was quiet, her tendrils doing their slow electromagnetic reading of everything around her, and I wondered what she was reading, what the room felt like to her, whether she could read the tension in it the way I could see it, and whether it made sense to her or whether it was just static. It was Dreenath Vass who spoke first. Dr. Saylorn, they said, with a particular inflection that was a Gethali signal for an instruction that would not be stated as one. An informal triage assessment would be helpful here. Dr. Saylorn was already on her feet. She moved to us with the economy of motion of someone who had been waiting for permission. She did something that surprised me. Before she pulled up her wrist scanner, she looked at Seal. Not at her readouts. At Seal directly, with a kind of attention that I had to revise my reading of her after seeing it. Then she ran the scan. Veth secondary respiratory syndrome, she said. Stress cascade presentation. The primary respiratory mechanism is compromised by sustained sympathetic nervous response. The Veth autonomic regulation system appears to be heavily influenced by social and environmental stability in early developmental stages. Without intervention, this presentation will become life-threatening within 12 to 20 hours. She was reading from the scan, but she was also reading something else, something in the data that was making small adjustments to her expression. She needs hydration support, a thermal environment in the species' optimal temperature range, and an extended period of low-stress sensory input. She looked up at me. What have you been doing for her? Talking, I said. Something moved across Dr. Saylorn's face. Not quite a smile. Something more compressed than that. Something that lived between professional acknowledgement and the kind of feeling professionals often don't let into their faces when they're on the clock. Dreenath Vass was quiet for a long moment. The quality of their stillness had changed in a way I couldn't fully articulate. The same posture, the same depth of Gethali motionlessness, but something underneath it had shifted. When they spoke, the words were formal and deliberate in the way of a decision being made out loud rather than announced. The session is suspended. Dr. Saylorn, please begin medical support. A pause with the specific texture of something being decided against resistance, or against habit, which in Gethali culture amounted to the same thing. Representative Calloway, stay. The others left. The 2 Veth observers did not. Nobody told them to go and nobody told them to remain. They simply stayed in their corner seats with the particular quality of attention that I was beginning to understand was Veth focus rather than Veth passivity. Watching the child. Watching me. Reading whatever they read in the air between us. Dr. Saylorn set up a small thermal field around the chair she guided me to and began the hydration infusion. A small patch on Seal's neck that delivered fluids subcutaneously. In a method, the compact medical database apparently had enough Veth data to support even if nothing else did. Seal tolerated it without distress. She was watching Dreenath Vass with those amber eyes, with the calm curiosity of a young thing that had exhausted its fear, and come out the other side into something more like assessment. What you have done today, Dreenath Vast said, once the room was arranged around the new reality of its occupants, is extremely difficult to process through any standard disciplinary framework. I know you have committed procedural violations that, formally documented, could result in the suspension of your secondment and a formal complaint to the Earth Diplomatic Corps. Yes. Dreenath Vast studied me for a long moment. When they spoke again, something had changed in their voice, not warmth, which was not a Gethali quality, but the specific absence of the usual cold, the way a room sounds different when you remove the white noise you'd stopped noticing. I would like to know what you were expecting to achieve by coming here. I thought about that. The honest answer was that I hadn't expected to achieve anything specific. I had reached the end of the system and found nothing on the other side of it except a form letter about processing timelines, and I had kept going because stopping meant setting her down in a corridor and walking away. And I was not capable of doing that, not because I am a particularly virtuous person, but because I had been sitting next to her for 7 hours and talking to her about cold coffee and maintenance corridors and my mother's garden. And by then she was not a paperwork problem to me. She was a specific, real, small thing that was going to be in serious medical danger in 12 to 20 hours if I didn't do something, and I was the only one there. But that was not an argument that played well in compact political spaces. The compact ran on frameworks, on mutual obligations and formalized relationships, and the careful management of competing species interests. Personal urgency was not a recognized category of appeal. I was aware of that and still had no other argument to offer. I was expecting, I said, that someone in this room would look at her and decide that the gap in the system was a problem worth fixing. Dreenath Vast studied me, and if we had not, then I would still be here, I said. I would have stayed here until the processing time elapsed or someone told me to leave, and then I would have made a decision about whether to follow that instruction, which I think both of us would prefer I not have to make. That was a more direct statement than I usually made in rooms like this. I watched Dreenath Vast process it. You erased a significant portion of your accumulated diplomatic credit this morning, they said. The 7 requests each flag your record. The security checkpoint bypasses create a review file. The unauthorized entry to a closed session creates another. These things will follow your secondment documentation. I know. You sacrificed a great deal for a child of a species with no treaty relationship with Earth, no bilateral agreements with the human diplomatic mission, no legal standing that creates any obligation on your part. They paused. Why? I looked down at Seal. Her eyes were on my face, the same amber focus they'd had since the first moment she found it in the corridor. The eyes that had no shared evolutionary history with mine, that processed light differently, that had oriented to my face in a moment of distress the way you orient to the thing in your environment that is not threatening you, which is the first and most ancient measure of safety any nervous system has ever had. Because she was shaking, I said, and I was there. They argued for 2.5 hours. I was not included in the argument. I was given a waiting room outside Chamber 7, and Dr. Saylorn brought her medical kit and stayed with me, and the thermal field hummed around the chair at Veth optimal temperature, and Seal went somewhere between alert and sleep in the warmth of it with her head against my chest and her tendrils doing their slow reading across my forearm. The hydration infusion was working. Her breathing was normalizing. Dr. Saylorn monitored the readings on her wrist unit and sat across from me, and after a while asked me if I wanted anything to eat or drink. I said coffee if there was any. She found some, not the Earth Cultural Exchange blend, something local and slightly bitter, but hot, and set it on the table beside me with the careful motion of someone doing a small thing as a substitute for a larger thing they can't do. What's happening in there? I asked. Species Welfare Protocol Debate, she said. Category 3 Designation Review. Emergency Classification Motion. A pause. A great deal of procedural discussion about what is and isn't precedent, and what precedent means for other Category 3 species, currently in observed status. Endrinath Vass. Listening, she said. Mostly, with the expression they make when they've already decided and are letting everyone else arrive at the same place. I looked at her. She was Pelari, with the Pelari quality of face that conveyed more than Pelari usually chose to convey when they chose to convey anything. Have you treated non-treaty species before? I asked. Yes, she said, 3 times in 16 years. Each time it was an emergency situation in which someone brought a non-treaty individual to me, and I made the decision that the medical ethics of my training superseded the procedural requirements of my jurisdiction. A pause. Each time I filed the appropriate violation reports afterward. Each time the review board found that my actions were technically unauthorized and technically correct. That must be a satisfying category to exist in, I said. It's a category that requires a particular kind of nerve, she said, and looked at Seal, or a particular kind of stubbornness. The Veth observers had followed us out of Chamber 7. They were standing near the far wall of the waiting room, not sitting, watching Seal with the sustained attention of people for whom something very important was happening. I had been aware of them since the chamber, and had not addressed them because I didn't know what the right thing to say was, and I had learned that silence was better than the wrong thing in most cases. One of them moved. Crossed the room not quickly, with the deliberateness of someone managing their own uncertainty carefully, and stood a few feet from my chair. I looked up. The Veth was tall up close, the tendrils long and active, doing a rapid and complex reading of the space between us, air pressure, temperature gradients, electromagnetic signatures, all the things the Veth read in what looked to human eyes like stillness. I held my position. I didn't tighten my hold on Seal. I didn't shift away or shift toward. I waited because waiting was the right thing, and I had spent enough time that day learning to recognize when waiting was what the moment required. The Veth reached out one hand slowly with infinite care, with the specific caution of someone extending something precious into uncertain space, and touched the top of Seal's head. Not a long touch, barely a second of contact, then withdrew. Seal's tendrils moved toward where the touch had been. Then back to my arm. The Veth looked at me. I did not have a reading for their face, not yet. I was too early in my understanding of Veth expression to know what I was seeing, but I nodded. It felt like the right language for the moment, an acknowledgement, an agreement about something that didn't need words. The Veth held my eyes for a long moment, then stepped back to the wall. We didn't speak again. We didn't need to. Something had been communicated, and I didn't need to be able to define it precisely to know that it mattered. The vote took 3 hours and 20 minutes. Dreenath Vass came out of Chamber 7 and stood in the waiting room doorway and looked at the two of us, at Seal asleep against my chest in the thermal field, and at me awake and holding her, and said, "Emergency species welfare designation for Veth dependents in compact space has been provisionally approved pending formal council review. The designation will allow for immediate medical treatment authorization, temporary care placement under emergency protocols, and emergency species registry creation. It will require a full session vote within 90 days to make permanent." "And Seal," I said. "A Veth community liaison is being contacted in the outer sectors. Transportation and temporary placement are being arranged." Dreenath Vass paused. "She will be placed in documented Veth community care within approximately 6 standard days." 6 days. I looked down at her. She had woken at the sound of Dreenath Vass's voice and was watching the coordinator with those amber eyes, with the calm that had settled over her in the past few hours, the calm of warmth and hydration and the slow return of a nervous system to something like its baseline. She looked like herself, or what I was starting to understand was herself, curious, watchful, steady in a way that seemed native rather than learned. In the interim, Dreenath said, with the particular quality of someone going slightly past what they are strictly authorized to decide, a care arrangement will need to be established. If you are willing to serve as temporary care contact, there is a provision under Compact Emergency Placement Rules, Section 44, Emergency Welfare Custodianship, previously applicable only to registered species, but now applicable under the new designation by extension, that can be applied. I looked at them. You'll need me to fill out a form, I said. Something happened in Dreenath expression that I had never seen there before and was not entirely sure I was reading correctly. It was very small and very controlled. It had something to do with their eyes. In 7 years of working in Dreenath sector, I had not previously seen their expression do anything I would describe as humor. Several forms, they said. Yes. Those 6 days were the strangest of my 7 years in the sector. I was not suspended. My supervisor communicated that I was in a review status that prevented standard duty assignment, and my caseload was redistributed with a terseness that communicated her feelings about the disruption. I was informed that a review would be thorough and that I should expect consequences. I acknowledged receipt of the message and did not reply further, because there was nothing to say yet, and I had 6 days of something more immediate to deal with. I spent those days in my apartment in the sector residential block, which had a window that looked out onto a maintenance corridor that was better than it sounds, because the dome was visible above it, and the slow rotation of the outer hull against the star field was the closest thing to a sky as you got in Governance Hub. I set up Dr. Saylorn's thermal field in the corner of the main room, the warmest corner, the one that caught the most light from the dome. I arranged it with the precision of someone setting up a space for a specific small person, which is what I was doing. I talked and she listened. I told her about Earth in the way you tell someone about a place you're homesick for without wanting to be, the specific details that rise up when you're far away, and the homesickness gets past your guard. The smell of rain on concrete in the specific way it smells in the neighborhood where I grew up, which is a smell I've never been able to accurately describe to anyone who hasn't experienced it. The weight of a particular kind of afternoon light in autumn, low and amber and slanted. The sound of human cities, the specific organized chaos of them, nothing like the compact hub's careful architectural proportionality, the way it was designed by committee to be navigable by 17 different species, and had ended up with the particular character of somewhere that belongs equally to everyone and peculiarly to no one. I told her about my mother's plants and the talking to them, and how I'd thought it was ridiculous when I was 12, and then done it myself 30 years later in a room with a sick alien child. Because that's how humans work. We absorb things, and then they come out of us years later when we need them, when we're sitting in a maintenance corridor at the edge of the universe trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. I told her about the first time I'd seen the Compact's hub from the approach shuttle. 29 years old, coming in on my first assignment, the scale of it filling the viewport. I'd grown up on a planet where the biggest human-made structure I'd personally stood near was a dam, and the hub had been, there was no good word for it. The way certain experiences are too large for the vocabulary you have available, and you just have to hold them without description. She couldn't understand any of it, but she listened. Her tendrils moved with the rhythm of my voice, not the survival listening she'd been doing on that first morning, reactive and desperate, but something more settled and interested. When I stopped, she made the high note that I'd learned meant continue, and I continued. On the third day she made a sound I hadn't heard before. Low, rhythmic, not distress, something else. A sound with intention in it. I sat very still and listened to it, and after several minutes I realized it was a response, not to the words, to the pattern. She was doing with her voice what her tendrils did with the air, reading the shape of what I gave her and giving it back to me in the only language she had. Call and answer, rhythm and return. I don't know exactly what she was saying, but it wasn't nothing. It was very clearly and specifically not nothing. On the fourth day, I took her to the hub's public observation gallery. Technically, I wasn't supposed to. The care agreement specified the residential block and medical facilities only, and the observation gallery was neither. I took her anyway, because she'd been agitated since mid-morning in a way I couldn't soothe. A restlessness that the thermal field and the talking didn't touch. And I had a theory about what it was and decided to test it. When the dome cleared, when the shields retracted and the stars came through, she went completely still. Every tendrils up and spread, open as I'd never seen them, doing a maximum range read of everything that was out there. Amber eyes wide, not the wide of fear but the wide of recognition. Completely silent. Not her distressed silence or her sleep silence, but a third kind I hadn't encountered yet. The silence of someone encountering something too important for any response. I held her up at the viewport, and we looked out at the stars together for about 20 minutes without either of us making a sound. I thought about things. The planet she'd come from, which I'd never seen photographs of. The fact that whatever her species' history with space travel was, whatever their relationship with the dark between stars, she looked out at it with the specific expression of encountering something known. Not learned from a briefing document. Known in some older and more fundamental sense. The universe is very large, and humans have been looking up at their piece of it for as long as they've been human, and something in that looking is still there in us. Something in the looking is still there in her. That's the thing that doesn't report well. It sounds sentimental. It probably is sentimental. I spent a long time apologizing for it and then I stopped, because sentimental is not the same as wrong. The Veth community liaison arrived on day 6. Her name was Veth designate Sara, a term of address that the translator rendered imperfectly, but that seemed to indicate something between community elder and family by agreement. A role that had no direct parallel in any human institution I knew of, but that made immediate sense as a concept. The way some things make sense before you fully process them. She was older than the 2 observers who had been in Chamber 7. Her tendrils longer and more patterned with the subtle color, shifts the Veth used for complex communication. She arrived with the compact transit team, and 2 members of the small Veth community she represented, and she stood in the door of my apartment and looked at Seal. Seal looked back. Sara's tendrils moved in a long, slow pattern. Seal's answered. It was the most complex tendrils exchange I'd watched at close range, not the simple call and return I'd seen in the waiting room, but something layered and extensive, something being established between them, a conversation in a language I couldn't follow. It lasted 2 full minutes. The 2 community members stood at the door and watched it without speaking. Then Seal looked at me. I had been told this was coming for 6 days. I had known from the first hour that this was the goal, this was the good outcome, the right outcome, the thing I had walked through the compact's chambers and burned my diplomatic credit to achieve. A Veth elder, community care, a permanent safe placement. This was everything I'd wanted. I had organized my 7 days around it. I had kept the end point clear in my mind specifically so I wouldn't lose track of what I was doing and why. She looked at me with those amber eyes, and I had to take a breath that was more work than it should have been. You're going to be okay, I told her, still the wrong language, always the wrong language with her. You've got people, you're going to be okay. Her tendrils found my hand one more time, stayed there for a moment. Doing that reading, the slow, steady reading of whatever she read when she held her tendrils on me. The electromagnetic signature of a human nervous system, maybe. The pressure gradients of my breathing. Whatever it was she had been reading every day for 6 days, the information she'd been assembling about the specific thing I was. Then she moved towards Sara, and Sara's tendrils came down around her, and the 2 of them did something that I didn't have a name for in any species language but recognized anyway, because recognition doesn't always require a name. The disciplinary review took 2 months. It was thorough. Every checkpoint bypass was logged and analyzed. Every procedural violation was documented and cross-referenced with the applicable protocols I had failed to follow. The 7 failed requests were examined for whether my interpretation of their failures had been accurate. It was, technically, and whether I had followed correct escalation pathways. I had mostly, with the exception of the direct communication to Dreenath Vass's office, which was 2 levels above my authorized communication chain. My supervisor presented her position that I had acted outside my authority. The Bureau of Species Welfare presented a similar position, with additional documentation of the procedural costs of my actions, including the processing backlog created by the emergency designation motion and the administrative resources required to implement it. Dreenath Vass attended the review board in person. This was unusual for a coordinator at their level. The review board was staffed by bureau directors, not council administrators. Dreenath Vass's presence required a formal status justification that I was told had been filed under material witness to initiating incident, which was accurate, and also told me something about how Dreenath Vass intended to use their presence. They did not advocate for me in any formal sense. They did not speak to my motivations or character or the specific weight of what I had carried down that corridor. They presented the sequence of events with Gethali precision, factually, completely, without editorial inflation in either direction. They noted the emergency designation motion, its origin in the incident, its subsequent passage through full council review. They noted the 3 other cases processed under the new designation in the 2 months since 2 Veth dependents in different sectors, and 1 pre-accession species juvenile of a different species entirely whose welfare situation had previously had no processing pathway. They noted these without argument. They let the facts sit in the room. The review board's finding was a formal written reprimand, logged to my record. No suspension, no referral to the Earth Diplomatic Corps. The written finding included a paragraph, unusual in a standard reprimand. The bureau director who delivered it noted, acknowledging that the procedural framework in place at the time of the incident had demonstrable gaps, and that the outcome of the incident had materially benefited from what the board characterized as unconventional escalation. Afterward, in the corridor outside the review room, Dreenath Vass stopped beside me. The designation vote, they said, required a great deal of procedural groundwork that could not have been laid in the time available if you had waited for the standard response cycle. I looked at them. Is that a way of telling me it worked out? It is a way of telling you, they said, that the system is not wrong to require process, and that there are moments when the cost of process exceeds what can reasonably be asked of a person with a conscience. You were in one of those moments. I am not certain you knew that when you started. I think you simply did not know what else to do. I didn't, I said. No. That is the version of events I am choosing to find defensible, Dreenath Vass said. Then they walked away down the corridor, straight-backed and measured, and I stood there with the formal reprimand in my file and 6 years left on my secondment, and felt the specific feeling of having spent something I couldn't get back in exchange for something I couldn't put a number on. Seal is 12 now, in Veth reckoning, which maps approximately to 16 or 17 in human developmental terms. She lives in the Veth community in the Compact's 3rd sector, which has grown from 6 individuals to over 40 since the emergency designation policy created a legal pathway for Veth settlement applications. There are children who have been born there since the community established formal residency. There is, Sara has told me, a growing waiting list of Veth who want to come. Seal is the oldest of the community's children, which makes her something between older sibling and minor legend among the younger ones. The community tells the story of how the policy came about the way families tell important stories, with elaboration and affection, and a degree of mythologization that Sara has gently encouraged me not to correct. In the version they tell, the human ran through the compact's central hub with a sick child in his arms, challenging the High Council one by one. The High Council watched without a word, and the human did not put her down. I did not run, and it was not the full council, and I said quite a few words. But the shape of the story is not wrong, and I have decided that the shape of a story sometimes matters more than the precise detail. I visit when I'm in the third sector. I've attended every community gathering I've been invited to, which is all of them. Sora told me early on that I had an open invitation, and the Veth mean that when they say it, which is a quality I find I trust in a species. Sora has taught me, with the patience of someone genuinely invested in the education of someone who is genuinely trying to learn, some of what the tendrils communication means. The basics. The equivalent of hello and are you well and I see you and I'm glad you're here. I have a few more complex patterns now, enough to follow a simple conversation between two Veth if they're speaking slowly, and I can see their tendrils clearly. Seal finds my attempts funny in a Veth way, which is not exactly the same as human funny, but which involves a specific tendrils flutter I've come to recognize as the equivalent of an affectionate laugh. She is growing into herself the way young people do everywhere, in all the ways that matter, figuring out who she is, developing opinions about things, arguing with Sora in the specific way you argue with someone you love and trust when you're becoming someone, and you're not sure yet who. She spends a lot of time in the observation gallery. She has, Sora has told me, a particular gift for the tendrils language, a fluency and expressiveness that is unusually developed for her age. She has also picked up some standard, not a lot. A handful of phrases assembled over the years, the way kids assemble languages when they're surrounded by them without trying, from the compact's administrative broadcasts, from the species mix of the hub's common areas, from whatever she's absorbed without knowing she was absorbing it. She doesn't use it often. When she does, it's deliberate. The last time I visited, she found me in the corridor outside the community center where I'd been saying goodbye to Sora, and she walked up to me and said something. 2 words, standard, in a low and steady register that I recognized before I understood it, the way you recognize music before you identify the melody. I've got you. I stood in the corridor and felt the ground shift under me in the specific way it shifts when something you did years ago turns out to have been more than you knew it was at the time. When the thing you said into the dark, because it was all you had, turns out to have landed somewhere and become something. Yeah, I said, my voice came out rough, I cleared it. Yeah, you've got me. Her tendrils did the flutter that means the Veth version of an affectionate laugh, and she went back inside. And I stood in the corridor for longer than I needed to before I went to find Sora and sit with the community through the evening, watching the dome overhead, and the compact's slow mechanical turning, and thinking about the things the universe gets up to when we're busy filling in forms. I still believe in process. I still believe in systems. I still believe that the correct application of established procedure is how you get things done without anyone getting hurt. 7 years of working inside the compact's administrative structure has only deepened that belief, not weakened it. The emergency designation policy is better for existing as policy rather than as a single human's improvised decision. The welfare framework that now covers Category 3 pre-accession species in compact space is better for being a framework than for being a favor. Systems matter. Process matters. The work of building and maintaining them matters. I also know that the moment you stop being able to see the person on the other side of the procedure is the moment the procedure has become more important than what it was built for. And I know that sometimes the right thing to do is to pick up what's in front of you and walk until you run out of corridor, because the corridor's end and the room on the other side of them has people in it, and people, most of them, most of the time, will look at a child being held and decide that the gap in the system is a problem worth fixing. I burned a lot of credit that day. I'd burn it again. I'd do it exactly the same way, walk out of the system, Walk toward the thing that needed walking toward. Talk in the wrong language until something came through anyway. That's the other thing about humans the compact had not fully processed when it accepted our application for membership. We are not civilized in the sense of having smoothed away our oldest instincts. We are civilized in the sense of having organized those instincts into systems that are better than individual action, and then remembering, when the systems fail, what the instincts were for. The instinct was warmth. The instinct was the voice in the dark. The instinct was I'm here and I've got you and I'm not putting you down. We've been doing it since before we had language for it. We'll be doing it until the stars go out. And somewhere in the third sector of the compact's governance hub, a 17-year-old Veth girl with amber eyes and quick tendrils, and the specific laugh that sounds like nothing human and means everything the same, is doing it too, learning it in the same way all important things are learned, not from instruction, but from the memory of having been held.